Hello and welcome to the Utility Week podcast. I'm Rob Horgan, and as ever I'm joined by James Wallin to go over the biggest stories from the past week or so. To help us make sense of the local elections results, we are joined by Renewable UK Chief Executive Tara Singh. Hello Tara, welcome to the podcast.
Hi Rob, great to be here.
Obviously, we're recording this the Tuesday after the local elections. Is quite the moving feast. By the time you're listening to this, we may have a new Prime Minister, may not, but we won't speculate too much on that for fear of looking immediately silly.
Not that that's ever stopped us before, but in this occasion.
You can look silly. I don't want to look silly.
So let's delve in the local election results. That's the biggest one for us. Tara, obviously your background, you've been in energy policy for your entire career, more or less, haven't you?
Yeah.
And sort of taken over at Renewable UK 3-4 months ago now. Is that?
I think February, it's 2.5 months. 2.5 months. Yeah, end of February.
Yeah. Gives you a bit of a different perspective on things. But maybe before we dig into the results, let's touch on your background, just to sort of, give our listeners some context as to why you are the perfect person to help us unpick these results. So you sort of started in government, is that right? Policy advising?
Yeah, look, I started working for the Conservative Party in opposition then, right around the time when David Cameron became leader. So I had the energy environment brief. I think I got given it because at the time, no one, the Conservatives, cared, and I was seen as a bit too left-wing to do a quote-unquote real Tory brief in the research department. He became leader, and along with people like Oliver Letwin, just really doubled down on supporting climate change, supporting kind of investment in green technology. And then I guess I had that tried and tested special advisor path, or bag carrier path, actually, of when the Conservatives got into government. I joined Number 10 as the energy advisor in the coalition government. So we were developing the first CFDs for renewables. We were trying to get fracking going, which is a whole story in itself, which we can come on to if you want. We were trying to kind of support the oil and gas sector through the Wood Review. And then after that, I worked for Shell in a global policy role. So that was looking at, for Shell's power business, how could they work out where to put their money for offshore and onshore renewables, for trading, for e-mobility, for hydrogen, at a time when Shell was really doubling down on clean energy. And now I am 2 months into being CEO of Renewable UK. And we look after over 400 member companies from across the clean energy value chain, with a real focus on and offshore wind, battery storage, hydrogen.
Should we talk about that juxtaposition potentially some people might see from your background at Shell to now being at Renewable UK? There was I think when I was speaking to your comms team, they had a lovely phrase where you're not ideological about different energy sources, just pragmatic. I thought that was quite a nice, a nice way of phrasing it, really, but also something you perhaps wouldn't expect of someone leading a renewables trade body. So.
Rob, I'm getting old. I'm not going to tell you how old I am. You can go back to my LinkedIn if you're interested. But so when I worked for David Cameron, it was the first time in recent history that Russia invaded Ukraine. They invaded the Crimea, and energy prices immediately spiked. And what happened was, very quickly a political dividing line emerged, where those on the left were blaming vested interest and profiteering, and those on the right were blaming, it must be all of this kind of climate change nonsense. That must be why our bills are high. And I think that narrative has not really gone away. And if you look at More in Common polling, they will show you that actually the reason people have been voting in the recent local elections has been on cost of living issues. They, again, if you lean right, you blame net zero. If you lean left, you blame profiteering companies. And actually, my view has always been you need a mix of energy sources in order to have a stable economy. And I think actually it's very easy to blame one part of the value system, but we need everything. And actually, in the renewables industry, we very much recognise, of course, you need some nuclear, of course, you need some gas. If you're going to have gas, good for it to come out of the North Sea. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doubling down on renewables, because renewables are the cheapest form of energy we have. And if you care about price stability and you care about energy security, renewables just are the best answer. So I think for me, I'm not opposed to any form of energy, but I'm also very much fact-based and pragmatic. And I think we have to start from that position.
let's touch on that blame game that you mentioned there, because that is obviously something Reform has used in its sort of lobbying up until this point, particularly against renewables. Do you think that played a factor in people's voting at the local elections last week?
Yeah, again, so I think the ECIU had some more in common polling about the local elections. And what was fascinating was the number one issue is cost of living. So I think since Russia invaded Crimea in 2013, we have never really stabilised our economy. And I think people are sick of being told, don't worry, government is doing X and everything will get better. And there's a perception that actually, from a cost of living perspective, it hasn't really changed that much. And people were just frustrated. And I think that was really driving votes. But if you then look into the polling, people aren't anti-renewables. Like, actually, even with reform-leaning voters, more than 2/3 are actively positive about renewables. For the conservative-leaning voters, they're 80%. For Labour and the Greens, it's kind of, almost all of them. So people recognise the value of renewables, but they're just frustrated with being told, we're doing this great stuff, and yet my bill is so high. And of course, that is actually driven by the crisis we're seeing in Iran. And that is a very complicated message to explain to people. So I think if you want to win votes, it's easy to pick a bad guy and harder to sort of have a thoughtful discussion about energy policy.
So if you were still a government advisor, what would you be saying to Ed Miliband and Starmer to counter that message from Reform?
Yeah. Look, I think Ed Miliband's doing a really good job on lots of things, but including on the messaging, because, the number one message is we want homegrown energy to secure our energy independence. And if you don't have homegrown energy, you're relying on increasingly LNG from far-flung parts of the world. And one geopolitical event in Iran can take 20% of the world's LNG capacity offline. And that is a very dangerous position to be in for any country. So I think the energy security message is really strong. I think the price stability message is also important, but this is a harder one to explain. I think contracts for difference, fixed price contracts for difference, they protect consumers because when power prices are high, driven by geopolitical events like in Iran, which pushes up the gas price, renewables pay consumers back. So in the last crisis, in 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine the second time, the government spent £44 billion subsidising gas bills, but renewables at the time paid back 500 million. And actually, there was some great analysis from Carbon Brief from only this week, which said that renewables have saved consumers £1.7 billion since the crisis began through avoided gas costs. So I think that price stability message is really key too. And then the final part is green jobs. So we've got 55,000 jobs in renewables, in wind already. That will more than double by 2030. We spent £100 billion building the offshore wind industry. We're going to spend another £100 billion just to 2030 again. A lot of that is in previously industrial areas which are tending to lean reform. And those are jobs on the ground. And actually, if you look at reform mayors like Luke Campbell, they will actually say, what's not to like about clean jobs. So for me, I think that local value piece is really important to win over reform because it shows the value to communities. But I think for the public as a whole, it's the price stability, it's the energy security messages as well.
Do you think the £300 off your bills message has ended up haunting Ed Miliband, having such a specific figure with no kind of counterfactual to that of how you're ever going to prove it? Do you think that's what has led to a lot of the backlash that we're getting at the moment to clean power and net zero?
I think the backlash would have been there anyway because people are just so tired of the cost of living being such a massive issue, which it has been for over almost 20 years now. And I think, to his credit, Ed Miliband was the first to recognise this. So in 2013, there were several things he said which made everyone in the Conservatives roll their eyes. So one was, we need a price cap for domestic consumers because they're being ripped off. And we literally laughed about that. David Cameron called it communist plot. And then fast forward a few years and Theresa May adopts it as her flagship election policy with an article in the Daily Mail, front page of the Daily Mail, 100 quid off bills. And I think, that is a good sign that Ed Miliband has very good political antennae. He always has. And I think he got the cost of living issue faster than anyone else, and he is still saying that's his priority, which is the right thing to do. I think in terms of £300 off bills, I think it's always difficult as a politician to talk about counterfactuals, but actually this is something that we in the renewables industry are also trying to find our way on, because the truth is that renewables are very good value for money, because gas generation is bad value for money, nuclear is quite expensive. We kind of don't have that many options. It's very difficult to go to the public and say the energy system has got more expensive, but renewables are the best value. It would be much cleaner if we could say we're going to save you, your current bill will take off X £100. Like, that's a very difficult. So I think talking about counterfactuals is always very difficult, but we have to try and explain what you're comparing in the energy system.
I wanted to come back to your point on Luke Campbell there, just because I think that is a really interesting example within the Reform Party of perhaps their local politics being different to the national politics, if you see what I mean, what they're saying at a local level compared to what, say, Richard Tice is saying, which we'll come on to talk about soon, I'm sure. Not least because I went to university in Hull and had the honour of boxing with Luke Campbell, which was not fun for me.
Who won?
Yeah, well, I'll leave that for you to all guess. But people in the energy sector will look at the results, see Reform has done really well at a local level, and there is a fear that might lead to some projects being blocked at a planning level, or not blocked, but objections raised by Reform councils now, or Reform councillors. Do you see that playing out, or do you think there'll be more pragmatic, as Luke Campbell has been in his area?
Look, I should say we are, as an organisation, politically neutral, and I think my starting point is no one gets into politics except to try and fix things. And I think, particularly for Reform, they, at a national level, they have a bunch of politicians who have really had a certain viewpoint for a long time, and they've stuck to it, and they've been very passionate and committed to it. And they haven't got into politics except to try and help the country in their view. So I always start from the starting point of they really do worry about low cost electricity, and they worry about energy security. And it's our job as an industry to demonstrate the value renewables bring for those priorities. So I think we have to start from a point of we actually want the same thing. We just have to make our case and make sure we can explain the value that renewables bring. I think the other thing I would say is that a lot of businesses want to buy their own wind and solar power, and Reform are quite positive about that. I think where they have concerns are probably, firstly, is there government money being spent, and is it being spent wisely, or bill payer money? And I think the second thing is going to be at a local level, is this benefiting local people or not? And that's the same challenge that every political party has. So I think, locally, whether it's Labour, Conservatives, Green, Plaid, SNP, whoever you can think of, as a developer, you have to prove the local benefits case. Otherwise, your project is going to struggle to get ahead. I think if we do see spurious blockages from any political party, then there is quite a clear process for that. Every local party still has to follow national law, which is, of course, you have to develop plans in line with net zero. There are certain rules that you have to follow. You can only block or object, I think, a maximum of 1 time, not 3 times before the planning inspectorate gets involved. So there is a process that has to be gone through. And I don't think any political party which has spurious objections will ultimately succeed, because our planning system has been designed to avoid that. But of course, that where there are genuine local concerns, it's our job as developers to prove that we're working in concert with the local community, not against them.
You must be concerned, though, about even if projects can't necessarily be derailed by local objection, there's going to be a blocker, isn't there? We risk having these few years of projects, constant delays at a time when we really need to accelerate. Certainly, if we're going to meet the kind of clean power target, but even to get to the further decarbonisation targets.
Yeah, look, I think a few things. So it's very easy to get swept up in the election results, but just a few things I would say. So firstly, I think only 1/3 of English seats changed hands. So that's the first thing. The second thing I'd say is if you look at Wales, we've got Plaid Cymru is the largest party. If you look at Scotland, the SNP are back. The Greens have done quite well. I know it's tempting to kind of frame this in a certain way, but I don't think actually the electoral reality suggests that every local council is going to be ideologically opposed to any renewables. I just don't think that's the case. And I think ones where there are parties who naturally have more scepticism, it's back to that example of, local mayors and councils on the ground. If we can prove that we are adding value to their projects, then I think we can start a conversation. I think, there are some things which are contested. So I think pylons is a really good example. So we did some research where if you just ask people in Wales, what do you think about undergrounding cables? Straight away, everyone's like, yep, we should do that. We don't want pylons. But if you then say, actually, undergrounding cables cost 5 times more, then it flips. And more than 2/3 of people don't support it. So I think it's back to that kind of open discussion with politicians about, if you do this, then this is the consequence. And I think that helps frame the debate a little bit too.
Should we come on to that sort of interacting with the different parties and sort of...
Absolutely.
I assume you spend a lot of your time now advising different project developers how to engage with the sort of different parties and the different ways of going about it. So yeah, I don't know. Any tips that spring to mind straight away?
One thing I'd also say, which I forgot to say, which is in Scotland, the Scottish government can decide, I think, projects over 50 megawatts. In England and Wales, I think anything over 100 goes to Westminster anyway. So for a lot of our developers, that local engagement piece is important for the community, but actually the decision gets made elsewhere. So that's the first thing I'd say. I think the second thing is we always advise developers to firstly build those relationships with communities. That's the most important thing. But secondly, when you're meeting politicians, always start from the areas of alignment. And I think everyone cares right now about energy security and bills, and that is what we have to prove. I think the other thing that politicians always care about is local benefits. So what's the business rates? What will it mean for the local council? Will they get some money from it? What can they do with that money? What does it mean for community benefits? So again, in our polling, we found that if you tell people in Wales that for every £1 profit, 37p goes back to community and benefits, then actually 2/3 of people support local wind farms. So I think for me, it's just always about proving the values case. And I don't think it matters whether you've got a Conservative government or a Labour government, or indeed Green Reform applied. We're engaging with everybody, and we're engaging with the kind of, I guess, universe of think tanks around all of those parties as well. So, we're going to be engaging with the Greens, with Reform, with Plaid, SNP, with Labour, with Conservatives, with everybody. I think the Conservatives and Reform are not anti-renewable, in my view. They are anti-excessive government intervention, in their view, excessive government intervention. So I think we have to show them what models exist that maybe might chime more with their ideological viewpoint. But also, I think we have to show why existing government contracts for difference are actually good value for money for consumers. It's back to that baseline of gas generation, even before the current crisis, is so unbelievably expensive, and you don't want to be relying on it. So then it really comes down to nuclear SMRs, which on current projected prices look quite good value. I think the question is, will costs go up? And also, how quickly can you build them? And what I have been told is that you're looking at maybe a couple of gigawatts over 10 to 15 years. So, given that data center demand is 40 gigawatts, nuclear SMRs are important, but they're not the whole solution by themselves. So then it comes to, are there other sources of gas which could be cheaper than the current gas that we're buying? And I think it's the North Sea, but, if you look at the oil and gas industry's best estimates, I think the North Sea can provide half of net zero gas demand by 2050. So again, it's not an answer by itself. And by the way, North Sea gas is not cheap either. No. There's fracking, which is Reform's answer. I think I tried to get that going in number 10. I'm personally not against it, but I think it's a distraction because the resource is uncertain and community support is not there. So even if you poll Reform voters, it is bottom of the list. So I think that is a hill to climb if they want to get that going. So you're back to renewables, right? So I think helping make the case for why renewables are the best answer we have right now is a real priority for me. And I wrote a piece in The Spectator actually saying, don't see wind as woke. And that is my view. I think the state with the most renewables in the US is Texas. You don't have to put renewables in a certain ideological bucket. It's just one way of getting energy, but it's a really good way of getting energy.
Just back on your points about them not being anti-renewables, and I think that's a fair point on the Conservatives, because I think it is a little more nuanced there. But Reform, they're pretty anti-renewables, aren't they? I mean, they talk about net zero stupid. They talk about bad ideological choices. I mean, they're pretty blatantly anti-renewables, aren't they?
I don't think, I wouldn't want to speak for them, I should say, but I think drilling into language a little bit, firstly, net zero renewables are not the same thing.
True.
Net zero is quite a complex societal task, which involves everything from agriculture to aviation. And I think renewables is a part of that. But even if you don't care about net zero, the Texas example, renewables are still a really good way of getting energy. That's the first thing. I think the second thing is there is probably a suspicion about the way that Labour frames renewables, because we have a clean power target. There is, I think potentially if you lean to the right, you might have a scepticism about anything that looks like government is driving it rather than the market is driving it. So that's the second thing. I think if you look at what Reform have said about community energy or rooftop solar or businesses buying clean energy, they seem even at national level to be reasonably supportive. I think where it gets complicated is on the contract for difference issue, because that is the one area where I think we do have an area of disagreement with Reform, and I think my job is to try and explain why any policy which tore up CFDs would not actually save consumers money.
Well, what is the answer to that? I mean, first of all, surely there's just a basic legal argument there, right? You can't come in and start tearing up these contracts and then inspect investors in any industry to come into the UK, right? That's got to be the first argument.
Yeah, look, so I think they are private law contracts, which means you can take the government to court and get your money back. So I think, that's the first thing, is that there is quite a lot of protection in them. I think the second thing is let's imagine that as a government you tried to find a way to remove those protections. And even if you didn't succeed, what message would that send? And I think what's quite interesting is even some of the right-wing think tanks have been quietly a bit concerned about this policy from Reform. And I think that's because it sets a very dangerous precedent if you don't honour government legal commitments. And arguably, Reform might say, well, we don't care about renewables. Who cares if you spook investors? But investors in any government contract will be concerned. So if you think nuclear also has CFDs, gas has capacity market contracts, which is also with the same counterparty, by the way, the LCCC. If you think of the oil and gas sector, they have decommissioning deeds, which again, private law contracts that government will honour the decommissioning tax relief. If you look at water or rail or energy networks, all of them have a form of government-backed support. So we've been talking to investors and they are all privately very worried about this. And I think my job is to help explain that if you did try and tear these up, you're not going to save consumers any money. It's very difficult to do legally, but in the course of doing so, there's going to be a chilling effect on infrastructure investment overall. I don't think this is the best way to deliver Reform's goals about cheaper energy, which we support. And I think if we can work on how do we take cost out of the energy system, that is a really productive place to be.
What about we put another scenario to you that I've heard from across the right. I'm not going to make it about any particular party, which is that we want to reduce bills. We're spending a lot of money building renewables and building out the energy grid at a pace. We need to slow down. We've got enough. We should cancel the next contracts for difference round. Stick with what got at the moment and slow down the pace of the energy transition. What would be your counter to that?
I think there are two separate things here. So the first thing is on where do you think demand is going to go? And this is actually quite a complicated question because I think most demand forecasts turn out to be wrong. But if you imagine that we're going to adopt a lot more EVs, which is the trend across the world, if you imagine that data centres are going to come to the UK, we've got 40 gigawatts of data center demand. I think we've only got 60 gigawatts of like peak capacity or something similar to that. If you imagine that industry is going to electrify, then you need more power. And it comes down to where is the power going to come from? And it's back to that kind of spiral where gas generation looks unbelievably expensive. So in January, I think DESNZ's forecast was that new offshore wind was 40% cheaper than new gas generation, and new onshore was half the price. And this is at normal gas prices, which I think was 69p a therm. Clearly at crisis gas prices, the differential is much bigger. So, gas gen is not a good bet. Nuclear SMRs, you're not going to build enough capacity fast enough and the costs are uncertain. So what's your alternative? And I think we're back to renewable. So I think if you believe demand is going to increase, then you need to have the power to supply it. And the economy of the future is an electrified economy. And that's I think that's what we need to be moving towards. And I think the other question is what happens if can you pause things? What happens if you pause planned investment? And I think that comes down to this discussion about a bit of a chilling effect on the supply chain, because if you want to take cost out of the energy system, the best thing you can have is certainty, because if you're building a turbine factory or a cabling factory, you need to know what your pipeline of orders will be. And if it's very stop-start, then you never develop scale. And actually, this has been a bit of a theme across Europe for renewables. It's been a little bit stop-start sometimes, and that's why you haven't had a kind of Chinese-style approach where they've had 20 years of projects and therefore the costs have really come down. We've had costs come down a lot, but they could have come down a lot more if we'd had a bit more stability about that pipeline, I think.
And stability also brings jobs, back to your other point.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
With all that in mind, we look forward into the not so distant future now to AR8. What is it that you're hoping for at Renewable UK? What are you looking for at AR8?
So I think we're looking for a kind of auction round in line with delivering clean power by 2030. I think for offshore that means roughly the same level that we've had previously. I think for onshore, we're a little bit behind where Clean Power says we need to be. I think we're looking for stepping stone projects for floating, because that's a massive potential industrial opportunity for the UK. And then I think the other thing we're looking for is a bit more certainty on connections reform, because the two go together. So you need to have a connections offer to bid into AR8. And you also, for existing projects which have CFDs, they need to know they're going to get connected in line with their CFD. So that is the kind of other bit that we're talking to government and to NESO about as well.
And in terms of possible projects that could bid into AR8, you're hearing there's going to be enough to procure a similar amount to AR7, or?
Yeah, I think I think we've said there's about 16 gigawatts which is eligible to bid. So that's like a huge amount. I think So I think there are projects that are ready. The pipeline is ready to go, and there's a lot of kind of commitment from the industry too. And it's back to having a pipeline of projects. So I think there's a lot of supply chain investment that's ready to land. As I said, 100 billion over the next 5 years, just in offshore wind alone. So that's really good news, hopefully, for some industrial parts of the UK.
Yeah. And tying this into what we were saying before about, I guess, political uncertainty, you've not seen any of that feeding through to who potentially might bid in the next auction round?
I don't think so. Yeah, I think, like I said, the main uncertainty for our members is on grid. On connections. So I think that is something which members are very interested in solving with government and NESO, and we're actually having some really productive conversations with them. So I think all of us are in the same place of wanting to fix this. It's just quite complicated because we're moving between the old regime to the new regime. So I think, I would say there's not as much political uncertainty as you would think, because the current government has been very committed to renewables. And I think whatever happens with what's going on this week, we think the Energy Secretary, Ed Miliband's doing a great job. So is Michael Shanks, the Energy Minister. And fortunately, both of them seem to be in very strong positions with the Labour Party and with Labour MPs. So I think that commitment hopefully will continue.
Are you concerned Ed might get pushed up to leader again? And would that affect, I guess that wouldn't affect the energy?
Unfortunately, my members don't give me license to speculate on such things. But I think he's
some
definitely
real fence sitting there.
Yeah, he's a huge ally of the the sector. And like I said, he's been remarkably consistent. So I think along with calling for a price cap in 2013, the other thing he called for was what he then called a power sector decarb target, which we now call a clean power target. And I think, if you did some back of a napkin numbers around how much we would have saved if we had moved faster on clean power, given Russia, Ukraine, given what's happening in Iran, I think it'd be a really big number. So he's been remarkably consistent for his whole political career, which is pretty rare these days, I think.
He'll want to stay in the energy department, won't he? He looks like he's finally settled and happy, I would say. I
don't know. I mean, who knows how politicians think? You have to be a particular kind of person to be a politician, right? I think I wouldn't want to comment unless I get in trouble, put it that way.
If we can go back perhaps to a safer space. Onshore wind. You talked about the the connections, obviously massive challenge there. But what else? What else is holding up progress on onshore wind? And particularly, we didn't see much movement in the last auction rounds in onshore wind in England, despite the lifting of the de facto ban. What do you think is needed to unblock that?
Yeah, so the de facto ban was lifted in July 2024 when Labour got in, and it takes time to filter through. So as I said, we've got a big pipeline of projects, and I think there's a lot of interest. So I think we will start seeing an uptick, I hope. I think slightly beneath that, there is still a journey to take local planners on regarding the value of projects and how we engage with communities as well. Because I think sometimes there's a gut reaction from local planners that they are concerned about any kind of infrastructure. And, it's not just renewables, it's housing or railways or 5G towers. We've kind of had a little bit of a world in the UK where people have been nervous about having infrastructure too near them. And I'm hoping that will start to change, because I think the industry is doing a really good job with local community engagement, particularly on the benefits side. So we're doing some really interesting pilots with money off bills, for example, which has gone down really well. I also think that we've had such a long period of lack of economic growth that there is a bit of a mindset shift. And you've seen the Labour Growth Group has 100 MPs. And the thing they are campaigning on is, let's get stuff built. And I think that is quite a helpful mindset change as well. I'm confident. I think it takes time to filter through. I think the public are recognising we need this infrastructure. I think the industry's also done a really good job on the ground. So, fingers crossed we'll start to see some more projects coming.
Why do you think we have? It's a big question, I acknowledge. Why do you think there is that change in mindset about infrastructure from people? I mean, from the public, because we've gone through periods before, certainly sort of post-war periods, where there's been big swathes of infrastructure, and I mean, I don't know, I wasn't around then, but it sounds like it was accepted. Why do you think that that there is more resistance these days to that?
So I am now totally making this up because I don't know if this is true. I'll tell you my gut feeling.
Yeah, go on. Yeah.
I'll just say it with a lot of confidence.
Yeah.
I reckon that there was always resistance and then people overcame it. So I'll give you a great example. Right. If you look at when the national grid was first developed in the 1930s, there was so much opposition. You can look up all these famous poets came out and wrote letters to the Times, saying how these horrific pylons were going to destroy the countryside, and there was a whole campaign about, why do you need electricity? What's the point?
Really, was there?
Yeah.
Oh wow.
And I think if you also look at when all the kind of gas networks were brought into towns, when we went from coal gas to North Sea gas.
Yeah.
That was very disruptive. There was people going in people's houses, and I think that also got a lot of pushback. And then very quickly people were like, oh, actually, it's fine. And I recognise my life has benefited. I think the challenge we have now is there was a moment in the 1930s when it was like, now your house is fully electrified. And that must have been astonishingly amazing. And same for North Sea gas. The moment when you go from not having central heating to having heating and having gas hobs that you can cook stuff with easily, that must have been the most transformational experience. And the challenge we have now is we're substituting energy sources. So it's not as obvious as you switch on the light and there's magic. And that is always a harder story to sell. And I can't think offhand of any country with a kind of democratized system which has not had a little bit of push and pull on this. So again, interestingly, for my example of Texas, you get a lot of planning objections in Texas. So, there is a lot of it's quite hard to get stuff built. There's lots of layers of local government. There's lots of permitting. And I think you're starting to see actually with data centers a real pushback because of how they price power in Texas. If you have a data center near you, there's a decent chance your power bill will go up. And that is causing huge opposition, you can imagine. So I think this is just a challenge that any democratized system has. And I guess the counterpoint to that is if you take communities with you enough that they are accepting of it, then I think we can still get stuff built. I don't think you need, I don't think you need to worry that people are as against stuff as you think. Like I say again, we know that in Wales, 71% of people actively support renewables, only 4% actively oppose. We know that once you explain community benefits, 2/3 of people will be very happy to have an onshore development near them. So I think the public are more positive than politicians might realise.
Yeah, maybe. No, I didn't know that.
I also don't think there was this kind of golden era when everyone was like, just build stuff, we love it.
No, maybe not. And at least we haven't got the poets against us this time. Imagine if the poets turned against us.
I want to Google this. I feel like it was John Betjeman. I think it was someone really famous was complaining, but I might be wrong.
I can imagine them being, quite ideologically associated with candlelight. So, imagine electricity was just not romantic enough for them.
But something else I'd say is it's interesting. So I'm half Indian. I went to India just as a kind of tourist in September, and they have 5G everywhere. So even when you're buying from a chai wallet on the side of the road, you're using your phone with a QR code to pay them. They all have mobile banking. And I was reflecting that India is a country which has been so poor, and they know that you need infrastructure to grow. And I think in Europe, we have kind of been quite used to sustained growth. And recently we have not had that. And I think that is also helping all of us understand that we need infrastructure to grow, right? I think that's, and you've seen, like I said, the Labour Growth Group, you've seen MPs becoming much more vocal about this recently. And I think this is a really good area of alignment, I hope, with right-leaning parties, because everything we can do to take cost out of the system by making the planning system more predictable, for example, that's going to be good for any energy technology.
Before we let you go, Tara, just circling back to the theme of this podcast around politics. Next week, we've got Utility Week Live, and James will be grilling both Richard Tice and Claire Coutinho on our keynote stage. If you had one question that you think James should put to both of them, what would that be?
Oh, gosh, what a good question. Oh, I feel like I need to think about this and write in. Tara from London says, I think I would ask them, what is your plan for energy for the future? Or indeed, does it even need to be a plan? Because I think that, for me, is slightly the missing chunk. I think it's good to understand what vision of the future are they backing and how exactly it would work. Because I think if you think about all of the priorities that they have, particularly energy security and low-cost energy, then I honestly feel that renewables are the best answer. And I think that the question then becomes, well, how do we deliver them in a way which maybe resonates better with their voters? So I think I'd probably just ask them, could they outline what exactly the energy mix is going to be under their governments?
And on that subpoint, that reminds me, we never came back to fracking. Which obviously is reform's silver bullet. So you sort of briefly touched on before why it isn't necessarily. But yeah, what would your thoughts be on a return to fracking?
Yeah, so I should say Renewable UK does not have a view. So this is very much my personal view. My personal view is I'm not against it. I'm pragmatic, but I did spend a lot of time in government, several years of my life trying to get it going. And, I would say the resource in the UK is uncertain. I think, unlike Texas, we don't have large swathes of land which are owned by one person. So that makes the planning side complicated. It also makes the infrastructure side complicated because fracking uses a lot of water. So in Texas, you can just, set up a whole pipeline. In the UK, you probably have to truck backwards and forwards. And that was the thing when we were doing at the time our engagement with local communities, it was the truck movements, which was the major issue. So I think people get hung up on the earthquakes. I think probably my personal view, I'm sure that can be managed responsibly. But the 50 lorry loads of water, a day or whatever it was some horrendous number. That was the thing that communities couldn't stand. So I think that makes it more complicated in the UK. Like, we're very densely populated. So I think it's complicated. It's not to say it can't be done, but my personal view is I think because it is so complicated, it's probably a little bit of a distraction for a future government. But, I'm not ideologically opposed.
Well, few topics for you there, James, to put to Tyson Coutinho next week. But thank you, Tara, for joining us on the Utility Week podcast, and thanks to everyone at home for listening.